Racist man tries to kick out a black woman. Instantly regrets it when she speaks. What happens when someone walks into a room, convinced they're the most important person there, only to realize they've made the biggest mistake of their life? A man steps into a high-stakes meeting, carrying himself like he already owns the place. He's new, but in his mind, that doesn't matter. He sizes up the room, deciding who is worth his time and who isn't. Then, his eyes land on her, a quiet woman, sitting among the executives, listening, but saying nothing. To him, she doesn't belong. Some people believe power is obvious. They think they can spot who holds authority and who doesn't, simply by looking. They assume that status comes with a certain appearance, a certain way of speaking, a certain place at the table. And when they don't see what they expect, they make a fatal mistake. And in that moment, he makes a choice, one that will change everything. With smug confidence, he interrupts, dismisses, and talks over her. His words drip with condescension as he mocks her presence. In his mind, he's setting things straight, reminding her where she stands. He believes he holds all the power. But arrogance is a dangerous thing when it blinds you to reality, because in just a few moments, the room will fall silent. The weight of his words will turn against him, and when the truth is revealed, his entire world will come crashing down. The conference room buzzed with quiet conversation. Employees sat around a long glass table, laptops open, notes ready. Sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, reflecting off polished floors. This was the heart of the company, where big decisions were made, where ideas shaped the future. And today, there was a new face in the room. Greg leaned back in his chair, adjusting his tie with a smirk. It was his first day, but he already felt like he ran the place. He scanned the room, sizing up his new coworkers. His eyes landed on a black woman seated near the end of the table. She was quiet, composed, listening intently. Greg frowned. An assistant? He thought it was odd that she was sitting at the table instead of standing by the door ready to take notes. The meeting began, and Greg wasted no time making himself heard. Greg had always seen himself as a man on the rise. From a young age, he believed success wasn't just about hard work. It was about knowing how to talk, how to present yourself, how to make people listen. He prided himself on his ability to command attention, to walk into any room and immediately make his presence known. It was why he had climbed the corporate ladder so quickly. He knew the right people, said the right things, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who already belonged at the top. Others might have spent years proving themselves, but Greg didn't think he needed to. He was sharp, charismatic, and ambitious. As far as he was concerned, those qualities were all that mattered. So when he was offered a position at one of the most prestigious companies in the industry, he wasn't surprised, he expected it. He saw it as a natural step in his career, just another place where he could outshine the competition. Greg wasn't here to listen, to learn, or to prove himself. He was here to take charge. From the moment he walked through the towering glass doors of the company's headquarters, he carried himself like a man who had already made it. He strode through the sleek, modern lobby, barely glancing at the employees who passed by. He wasn't interested in small talk or introductions. He was here for something bigger. Today was his first big meeting, a gathering of executives and key figures, and Greg intended to make sure they knew exactly who he was. As he stepped into the conference room, he took a quick glance around. A long, polished table stretched across the room, lined with high-ranking employees. The air buzzed with quiet conversation as they shuffled papers and prepared for discussion. Greg smirked. This is it. His chance to impress, to show these executives that he wasn't just another employee, he was someone they needed to take seriously. And then his gaze landed on someone unexpected. A woman, black, seated near the end of the table, quiet, composed. She wasn't talking, wasn't making any effort to stand out. In Greg's eyes, that meant she wasn't important. And that was his first mistake. Greg sat at the long, polished table with the kind of confidence that bordered on arrogance. His back was straight, his shoulders squared, and his fingers tapped idly against the smooth surface. He wasn't just attending this meeting, he was owning it, at least in his mind. He had always believed that success wasn't about patience or experience. It was about taking what you wanted, proving you were the loudest, smartest, and most decisive person in the room. That belief had carried him through his career, helping him climb the corporate ladder faster than most. He had worked in high-pressure environments before, places where hesitation meant weakness, where being bold was the only way to get ahead. And that's exactly what he intended to do here. He had barely been at this company for a week, but that didn't matter to him. He wasn't here to learn, he was here to lead. He had no interest in sitting back and observing, no patience for carefully calculated strategies or long-winded discussions. As far as he was concerned, he already knew how to run a business, and he had no problem letting everyone else know it. The meeting had barely begun before Greg started asserting himself. As executives took turns presenting ideas, he listened with an air of casual disinterest, arms crossed, his expression skeptical. He didn't bother hiding his smirks when he thought a suggestion was weak, didn't hold back on the occasional scoff when something sounded too cautious. He wanted them to see that he wasn't impressed. And when he finally spoke, it wasn't with hesitation, it was with the cocky certainty of a man who believed he was the smartest person in the room. "All right, let's be honest here," he said, cutting in before the current speaker had even finished. He waved a dismissive hand. "Some of these ideas are nice in theory, but let's talk about what actually works in the real world." A few executives shifted in their seats, surprised by his bluntness. Greg didn't notice, or if he did, he didn't care. "I've been in this industry long enough to know what makes a company truly successful," he continued, leaning forward. "And I can tell you right now, half of what we're discussing here, it's just feel-good nonsense. What we need is strong leadership. We need people who get results, not just talk about them." His voice carried through the room, the sheer confidence behind his words making it clear that he believed he was exactly the kind of leader the company needed. He didn't think twice about interrupting others, didn't pause to consider whether his words were out of place. He had convinced himself that he was the most important voice at this table, that everyone else should be grateful he was speaking at all. And in that moment, he wasn't just trying to prove himself, he was already acting like he owned the room. "That's a terrible strategy," Greg scoffed, cutting off another employee mid-sentence without a second thought. His voice was sharp, dismissive, as if he had been forced to endure their nonsense for far too long. "If we actually want results, we need bold leadership, not whatever this is." He let out a short, condescending laugh, shaking his head as he leaned back in his chair. The room fell into an uneasy silence. A few employees exchanged glances, shifting in their seats. The executive who had been speaking opened his mouth slightly, as if debating whether to push back, but Greg had already moved on, flipping through the presentation packet in front of him with an air of exaggerated disinterest. The tension in the room thickened. People weren't just surprised, they were uncomfortable. But Greg didn't notice, or worse, he did notice, and simply didn't care. His fingers tapped against the page as he sighed, shaking his head. "Look at this," he continued, his tone dripping with smug amusement. "We're sitting here, wasting time, listening to bad ideas because we're letting just anyone sit at this table." His eyes flickered, deliberately, pointedly, toward the black woman seated across from him. The moment stretched, heavy and undeniable. A few employees inhaled sharply. Someone near the end of the table stiffened, their hands clenching slightly. Others quickly averted their gazes, as if looking away would somehow make the moment disappear. Greg smirked. He liked that reaction. "No offense," he added, though his tone made it clear he meant the opposite of that. "But maybe leave the business talk to the executives." The room, already tense, froze. Several people went rigid. A young analyst, barely out of grad school, glanced around in shock, as if expecting someone to say something, anything. One of the senior executives visibly tensed, his jaw tightening, but he hesitated to speak. A woman sitting near Greg pressed her lips together, glancing toward the black woman, her expression a mixture of disbelief and unease. No one laughed, no one nodded in agreement. But Greg didn't seem to notice the weight of the silence. He didn't pick up on the way people's postures had changed, the way the air in the room had thickened. In his mind, he had just said what everyone was thinking. He had spoken with confidence, authority, the kind of blunt honesty that in his experience made people respect him. So, he leaned back, smug, waiting for someone to agree. Instead, all he got was silence. Heavy, charged, dangerous silence. The room went silent. The kind of silence that felt heavy, pressing against the walls, thickening the air. Some employees shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, their hands fidgeting with pens, notes, anything to keep them from looking directly at the scene unfolding before them. A few exchanged uncertain glances, while others darted their eyes toward the black woman, waiting, almost pleading for her reaction. But she remained still, calm, her expression unreadable. Greg, however, took this as confirmation of his superiority. He scoffed, rolling his eyes as if he had just proven his point. His smirk widened, the kind of smugness that came from years of believing he could say anything and get away with it. "See? Nothing to say," he sneered, leaning back in his chair with exaggerated confidence. "That's exactly my point. This is a boardroom, not a place for spectators." The insult lingered in the air, its weight pressing down on everyone in the room. A younger employee, barely 2 years into the company, looked visibly disturbed. He darted his eyes between Greg and the woman, his mouth slightly open, as if he wanted to say something, but fear kept his words trapped inside. He wasn't the only one. A few others shifted in their seats, their discomfort now impossible to hide. But Greg wasn't finished. He turned toward one of the managers, his tone casual, dismissive, as if the woman wasn't even sitting there. "Why is she even here?" he asked, waving a hand toward her like she was an afterthought. "I thought we were here to discuss serious business, not play some diversity experiment." Gasps rippled across the room. Someone audibly inhaled, sharp and quick, as if they couldn't believe what they'd just heard. One of the senior executives stiffened, his face darkened with disbelief. His hands, which had been resting on the table, slowly curled into fists. Finally, he had enough. "Greg, that is enough." His voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. Greg turned to him, unfazed, raising an eyebrow. "Oh, come on," he said, scoffing. "I'm just saying what everyone is thinking. We've got a business to run, not a social club." The younger employee, the one who had hesitated earlier, found his courage. "That's not what everyone is thinking," he snapped, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and nerves. "And if you actually listened instead of—" Greg laughed, a short mocking sound. "Relax, kid. You'll learn how the real world works soon enough." He turned back to the woman, still smirking, as if he expected her to finally shrink back, to fold under his words. But then, she moved. With careful, deliberate grace, she adjusted her chair, sitting up straight. She placed her hands on the table, fingers interlaced. And then, she cleared her throat. The sound, though small, echoed through the silent room. And for the first time since he had started talking, Greg's smirk wavered. Because something in her posture, something in the way she carried herself, suggested that she was about to say something he would never forget. Greg leaned back in his chair, his smirk still faintly lingering, though less confident than before. His arms were crossed, as if he were still waiting for someone, anyone, to back him up. But the room remained silent, the air charged with an unspoken tension that even he couldn't ignore. The black woman, the very person he had spent the last few minutes dismissing, sat unmoving. Her expression didn't shift, not to anger, not to offense, not even to surprise at his audacity. She was unshaken, and that alone made something uneasy stir in Greg's gut. Then, with a smooth, deliberate movement, she pushed back her chair and stood. The room seemed to hold its breath. Greg's smirk faltered, just slightly. She stepped away from her seat, walking slowly toward the head of the table. Each movement was measured, controlled, like a queen moving across a chessboard. And as she did, the energy in the room shifted. Employees who had been slouching suddenly sat up straighter. A few stole glances at one another, exchanging silent messages that Greg was too oblivious to notice. The authority radiating from her was undeniable. Greg frowned, his fingers tapped against the table. His confidence was slipping, though he didn't know why. And then she spoke. But before we get into that, have you ever witnessed a moment where arrogance meets reality? Where someone's overconfidence crumbles in an instant? Well, you're about to see exactly that. Before we continue, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more eye-opening stories just like this one. Turn on notifications so you never miss a moment where justice is served. Now, let's get back to the story, because what she's about to say, it will change everything. Because, she said, her voice smooth and steady, I own this company. The words cut through the silence like a thunderclap. Greg froze. His entire body went rigid. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. The smug expression he had worn so carelessly just moments ago vanished. The silence in the room was different now. It wasn't the awkward, tense kind that had followed his offensive remarks. It was the silence that comes when a room full of people realize they are witnessing something monumental. Greg's face paled as the woman continued her slow, purposeful walk toward the head of the table. I'm Olivia Carter, she said, her tone unwavering, CEO and founder of this company. Her words didn't just carry weight, they commanded the room. They weren't spoken to boast, nor to intimidate, but rather as a simple, undeniable fact. Yet, to those who truly understood the journey behind that name, those words meant everything. Because Olivia Carter wasn't just another corporate leader. She was the Olivia Carter, the woman who had started with nothing. The woman who had faced more obstacles than any person should have to endure. The woman who had been doubted, overlooked, and undermined not because of her skill, not because of her intelligence, but because of the color of her skin and the fact that she dared to exist in spaces where people like Greg had always assumed they belonged more than her. Her journey wasn't one of privilege. She hadn't stepped into wealth, hadn't been handed a trust fund, hadn't had a guaranteed safety net. She had clawed her way up, built something from the ground up with her own hands, and carved her name into an industry that had tried to shut her out at every turn. As a young woman, fresh out of business school, she had been turned away from opportunities less qualified candidates had walked into without a second glance. She had been told, not subtly, that she didn't have the right look for leadership, that she didn't have the right connections, that she should gain more experience while men who barely understood the industry climbed the corporate ladder without resistance. She had sat in meetings where her ideas were stolen. She had been spoken over, her presence ignored, her voice dismissed, until, of course, someone else repeated her words and took credit for them. She had heard the whispers behind her back, the doubters, the ones who assumed that if she did succeed, it was because she had been a diversity hire, not because she had the sharpest mind in the room. But Olivia hadn't let any of it stop her. She had worked harder, smarter. She had spent years perfecting her craft, learning every aspect of the business world, not just to succeed, but to ensure that no one could ever tell her she didn't belong. And when no one would give her a seat at the table, she built her own table. And now, that table was the very one Greg was sitting at. She let her words settle, watching as realization dawned on him, as his arrogance melted into something smaller. She turned her gaze to the rest of the team, her expression sharp yet composed. I started this company with nothing, she continued, her voice firm but never raising. I built it from the ground up, and I hired every single person in this room, including you, Greg. Greg swallowed hard. The power dynamic had shifted. And for the first time in his life, Greg was speechless. The air in the room seemed to shift again, as if an invisible weight had just slammed down on Greg's shoulders. Employees who had been holding back their discomfort now leaned in, their eyes fixed on Olivia, some with admiration, others with barely contained satisfaction. A few exchanged quiet smirks, watching Greg's confidence shatter in real time. A murmur rippled through the room, hushed but unmistakable. I knew this was going to happen, someone muttered under their breath, shaking their head. Another employee let out a low chuckle, arms crossed. He really thought he could get away with that. Further down the table, a woman whispered to the person beside her, "Did he seriously not know who she was?" "I was waiting for this," someone else murmured, eyes flicking between Greg and Olivia. "He's done," another whispered. barely containing a grin. Some just exchanged knowing glances, a silent, "told you so" passing between them. Others sat back, quietly enjoying the unraveling of Greg's misplaced arrogance. And in the midst of it all, Greg sat frozen, the weight of his mistake settling in as the room turned against him. Greg's mouth hung open, his mind scrambling for an explanation, a justification, something that would allow him to undo what had just happened. But there was nothing. Because Olivia Carter wasn't just some woman in a boardroom. She wasn't a silent observer. She wasn't beneath him. She was above him, and she had hired him. Greg swallowed hard. His confidence had drained from his face entirely. His usual arrogance, the way he carried himself with an entitled ease, was gone. Because now, for the first time since he had walked into this meeting, Greg realized exactly where he stood. Olivia picked up a folder from the table and flipped it open, her movements precise and deliberate. The weight of the moment settled over the room as she skimmed the pages. Though she didn't need to, she already knew what it said. "I personally reviewed your application," she said, her voice smooth yet cutting. "I believe in giving people opportunities, even when they don't deserve them." She snapped the folder shut with a sharp thud that echoed in the silent boardroom. "Unfortunately," she continued, her gaze locking onto Greg, "I made a mistake." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Greg's face twisted, his arrogance crumbling into something desperate, something panicked. His mouth opened as if to argue, but Olivia had already turned her attention to the security guards standing by the door.
"Please escort Greg out of the building," she said coolly. "His employment is officially terminated."
The boardroom erupted, not in chaos, but in an almost electric tension. Some employees stifled gasps, others exchanged glances, barely containing their satisfaction. A few leaned back, arms crossed, watching it unfold like a moment they had been waiting for. Greg stammered, his face turning an alarming shade of red. "Wait. You can't just..." But security was already moving. A firm hand landed on Greg's shoulder and he flinched. "Sir, let's go." He twisted in his chair, his bravado replaced with sheer panic. "This is a joke, right? I mean, come on, you can't fire me over this." He gave a weak laugh, searching the room for support. No one spoke. No one moved. No one was coming to his defense. Greg's breaths turned shallow as he realized the truth. His confidence had shielded him before, made him feel untouchable, but now it was gone. And so was his power. Dishco support speaking. "As an FYI, this call will be monitored for quality assurance and training purposes. Let me pull up your details quickly, give me just a second. Can you tell me your account email or phone number to confirm your identity?" "Okay, there you are. So what specs are you looking for in the upgrade? Any specific features or stuff that you've got your eye on?" Security gave him a slight tug. "Sir." With no other choice, Greg stood. The shuffle of his footsteps against the carpet felt deafening in the silence. His once cocky stride was reduced to something stiff and reluctant as he was led toward the exit, the eyes of every employee drilling into his back. He had come into this room feeling superior. Now he was leaving it with nothing. The heavy doors swung open, and just like that, Greg was gone. For a long moment, no one said a word. Then, slowly, Olivia exhaled and placed the folder back on the table. "Now," she said, turning back to her team with the ease of someone completely unshaken, "let's get back to business." Olivia turned back to the room, her expression calm yet unwavering. She took a moment, letting the weight of what had just happened settle in. Every pair of eyes was on her, some still wide with disbelief, others filled with admiration. "Let this be a lesson," she said, her voice steady and firm. "Respect isn't about titles, it's about character." A hush fell over the room, her words sinking deep. Some nodded while others glanced at one another, reflecting on what they had just witnessed. There was no need for further explanation. The message was clear. Across the table, an employee straightened in their chair, newly inspired. Another tapped their pen against their notepad, a small, knowing smile playing on their lips. A few exchanged quiet looks, as if silently agreeing that they had just seen justice served in real time. And just like that, the meeting resumed, this time with an air of admiration and renewed focus. The tension that had once hovered over the room was gone, replaced with a quiet sense of respect, not just for Olivia, but for the company she had built. Meanwhile, outside the boardroom, Greg stood frozen near the door. The security guards had left him there, no longer their problem. He clenched his fists at his sides, his face still hot with humiliation. Just minutes ago, he had been on top of the world, belittling others, certain that his presence alone demanded respect. Now he was nothing. The whispers from inside stung more than anything, the sound of Olivia's steady voice leading his meeting. The one he had thought himself above made his stomach twist. Employees who once tolerated his arrogance had already moved on, as if he had never mattered in the first place. Greg looked down at his hands, as if expecting to find something still there, some last shred of control. But there was nothing. No power, no authority, no job. In just a few words, he had lost everything. Greg stumbled out of the office building, his mind spinning. The heat of embarrassment burned through him, hotter than the afternoon sun beating down on the pavement. He adjusted his tie, a reflex, but it no longer sat with the same confidence. It felt tight, suffocating. Just this morning, he had strutted into the building, feeling untouchable. He had shaken hands with executives, flashed his overconfident grin at coworkers, and settled into his chair like he belonged at the top. Now, he wasn't even allowed back inside. He pulled out his phone with clammy hands, scrolling through his emails, hoping, praying for some loophole. Maybe HR had made a mistake. Maybe he could talk his way back in. Your employment is officially terminated. The words repeated in his head like a death sentence. A sinking feeling hit his gut. His email was still logged in, but it wouldn't be for long. The moment IT processed his termination, he'd be locked out. He knew how it worked. He had seen others get walked out before. He had laughed about it. But he wasn't laughing now. He hesitated before dialing a number. His old boss from a previous company. Greg had burned bridges when he left, bragging about how he was moving on to bigger and better things. But desperation made people forget their pride. The phone rang once, twice. Then, voicemail. Greg cursed under his breath and shoved the phone back into his pocket. His car was parked across the lot, but the walk felt longer than usual. With every step, reality sank in deeper. No job, no connections, no backup plan. He was Greg Harrison. He had always prided himself on his ability to talk his way into anything, to dominate any room. But today, for the first time in his life, he had talked himself right out of everything. The security guard by the entrance gave him a knowing look as he passed. Not mocking, not pitying, just a look that said, "You did this to yourself." Greg looked away. By the time he reached his car, his shoulders sagged. He pulled open the door, slid into the driver's seat and gripped the wheel. The same confidence that had fueled him that morning had completely vanished. He had spent his entire life believing respect was something he could demand, that power made him untouchable. But today, he learned the hard way. Respect wasn't about titles. It was about character. And Greg? He had none. Days passed, but the humiliation didn't fade. Greg replayed the moment over and over in his head. Olivia Carter, standing tall, unshaken, as she stripped away his arrogance with nothing but facts. He had been so certain of his own importance, so blind to his own ignorance. And now the price of his mistake weighed heavily on him. No company would touch him. Word spread fast in the industry, and with Olivia's influence, his name had already become synonymous with unhireable. Emails went unanswered, calls went straight to voicemail. Even his LinkedIn messages sat unread. For the first time in his life, Greg Harrison was powerless. He spent hours staring at the ceiling of his apartment, thinking. He had always believed that success was about dominance, that you had to be the loudest voice in the room to be heard. But Olivia had led with something else entirely: strength, intelligence, and most importantly, respect. She hadn't needed to shout to command attention. She had built something real, and he had tried to tear it down without even knowing who she was. That thought alone made him sick. So, for the first time in years, Greg swallowed his pride. He found himself standing outside Carter Enterprises, staring up at the towering glass building that he once walked into with swagger. Now, he hesitated at the entrance, gripping a small envelope in his sweaty hands. The receptionist recognized him immediately, her brows raising in surprise. "Greg," she said coolly, "what are you doing here?" He cleared his throat. "I was hoping to speak to Ms. Carter." Greg swallowed, gripping the letter in his hands. The receptionist's gaze was unreadable, and for a brief moment, he felt the same confidence that had once carried him through life, urging him to spin this into something smooth, something clever. A joke, a charming line, anything to regain control of the situation. But this time there was nothing to say. Because for the first time, Greg saw himself for what he truly was. His mind replayed that meeting over and over again. The way he had laughed, dismissing Olivia Carter without a second thought. How he had spoken over people, assuming his ideas were superior. The way he had looked at her, not as an equal, but as someone who didn't belong in the room. And the worst part? He hadn't even thought about it at the time. That was what haunted him the most. Greg had never considered himself racist. He had always imagined that word belonged to someone else. Someone cruel, someone obvious. But now, looking back, he saw the truth. It wasn't just the words he had said, or even the way he had dismissed Olivia Carter. It was the entitlement, the belief that he deserved respect, while others had to earn it. He had judged Olivia before she had even spoken. He had assumed she was beneath him, and why? Because she was a black woman in a position of power. The thought made his stomach turn. He had spent his whole life believing he was intelligent, deserving, and yet, when he had been given the chance to prove it, he had done nothing but show the world how small he really was. And Olivia? She had said nothing at first. She had waited, watched, and allowed him to dig his own grave. And when she finally spoke, she didn't have to raise her voice or insult him. She had simply been who she was. And that alone had destroyed him. Greg had spent years thinking that power was about control, that the loudest voice in the room was the one that mattered. But Olivia had shattered that illusion in seconds. True power wasn't about demanding respect, it was about deserving it. And Greg had deserved nothing. Now, standing in front of the receptionist, holding the letter in his hands, he felt the weight of his own arrogance pressing down on him. I wanted to apologize, he said again, his voice quieter this time. For the first time in his life, Greg wasn't speaking to be heard. He wasn't trying to win, to impress, to dominate the conversation. He just wanted to do one thing right. That caught her off guard. She looked him up and down, perhaps searching for the arrogance he had once worn like a badge of honor. Finding none, she picked up the phone and pressed a button. "Miss Carter, Greg Harrison is here. He says he wants to apologize." A long pause. Greg felt his pulse hammering in his ears. Then, finally, "Send him up." Greg stepped into Olivia Carter's office, the weight of his own actions settling over him. She was seated behind an elegant glass-topped desk, flipping through paperwork. Her demeanor was as powerful as ever, calm, commanding. She didn't look surprised to see him. She merely glanced up, her sharp gaze meeting his. "You have 5 minutes." Greg swallowed. He had rehearsed this speech in his head a dozen times, but now, standing before her, the words felt inadequate. "I was wrong," he began. "About everything." She raised an eyebrow. Greg took a deep breath. "I came into this company thinking I knew everything. I thought respect was something you could demand. I thought power was about being the loudest person in the room. And that blinded me," he exhaled. "The truth is, I didn't deserve to be here. And I definitely didn't deserve to talk to you the way I did." Olivia leaned back in her chair, watching him. He could tell she was weighing every word. "I lost everything because of my own arrogance," Greg continued. And honestly, I deserved it. But I don't want to be that person anymore. For the first time, his voice wavered. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect my job back. I just wanted to tell you that I see it now. I see why I was wrong. And I'm sorry. A heavy silence filled the room. Olivia studied him for a long moment, then slowly closed the file she had been looking at. People like you, she said, rarely admit when they're wrong. You think power makes you untouchable. Until, one day, it does. Greg nodded, shame burning in his chest. She tapped a pen against her desk. And now that you've learned that lesson, what are you going to do with it? Greg hesitated. He had been so focused on apologizing that he hadn't thought about what came next. I don't know, he admitted, but I know I can't go back to being the person I was. Olivia nodded, as if considering his words. Then, she reached into her desk and pulled out a small, folded paper. She slid it across the table toward him. Here. Greg picked it up cautiously. It was a business card, with an address, not a company name. He looked up at her in confusion. There's a mentorship program there, Olivia explained. They help people unlearn toxic mindsets, leadership training, personal growth, things you clearly never had. Her eyes locked onto his. It's not a job. It's an opportunity to prove that you actually want to change. Olivia watched Greg carefully, her expression unreadable. She had seen men like him before, entitled, arrogant, blind to their own ignorance. They walked into rooms believing respect was owed to them, never realizing that respect was something earned. She had dealt with men like Greg her entire life, in business meetings where her ideas were dismissed until repeated by someone else, in networking events where people assumed she was an assistant rather than the CEO. Even when she had first built this company from the ground up, investors had questioned her leadership, subtly suggesting she find a more experienced figurehead, a man to run it instead. Greg was just another reflection of the same prejudice she had spent years fighting against. And yet, as she looked at him now, she saw something different. He wasn't just angry. He wasn't just embarrassed. He was lost. She could see the wheels turning in his head, the foundation of his beliefs beginning to crack. He had spent his whole life confident in a lie, that he was superior simply because the world had always treated him that way. But today, for the first time, that illusion had shattered. She could have sent him away without a second thought, let him sit in the wreckage of his downfall, jobless and humiliated. But Olivia had never been the kind of person to let ignorance win. Change wasn't easy. She knew that better than anyone. It took humility, it took work, it took choice. So she gave him one. A mentorship program, one that forced men like Greg to confront their own biases, to listen instead of speak, to challenge the thinking that had been ingrained in them for years. It wasn't an olive branch, it wasn't forgiveness. It was a test. Would he take it? Would he actually change? Olivia didn't know, and truthfully, it wasn't her burden to care. But if Greg was willing to walk the hard road, if he was willing to prove that he wanted to be better, then she was willing to let him try. Greg's fingers tightened around the card. She wasn't just throwing him out. She was giving him something. A chance. His throat tightened. "Thank you," he said, voice barely above a whisper. She gave a small nod. "Don't waste it." As Greg stepped out of the building, a strange feeling settled over him, something he wasn't used to. It wasn't anger or entitlement or the smug confidence he once carried. It was something quieter, something heavier. Regret. Not just for losing his job, not just for embarrassing himself, but for how blind he had been. For years he had believed that power meant control, that respect was something you demanded, not something you earned. He had walked into that boardroom thinking he belonged at the top, only to be shown just how little he understood about true leadership. Olivia Carter hadn't just humiliated him, she had held up a mirror to his own failures. And the worst part? He saw himself, clearly now. As he walked down the street, he replayed everything in his mind. The way he had dismissed her, the way he had belittled others without a second thought. How many times had he done that before? How many opportunities had he lost simply because he had been too arrogant to see the people around him? Greg had always thought he was ahead of everyone else, but today he realized he had been the one left behind. The mentorship program Olivia mentioned lingered in his mind. A younger version of himself would have scoffed at the idea, dismissed it as beneath him. But today, for the first time, he wanted to change. Not to win, not to prove himself, but because he finally understood what respect really meant. Change wouldn't happen overnight. It would take time, effort, and humility, things he had never prioritized before. But now, he had a choice. Stay the same and let his past define him, or take a step forward, no matter how difficult it was. Greg let out a slow breath. For the first time in his life, he wasn't chasing power. He was chasing respect, and this time, he would earn it. Greg's story is a lesson for all of us. How often do we judge people before we even know them? How often do we assume things based on appearances, backgrounds, or outdated beliefs? Greg walked into that room believing he knew exactly how the world worked. He thought success was about power, about being the loudest voice, about deciding who deserved a seat at the table. But in the end, he learned the truth. Respect isn't about titles. It's about character. We live in a world where people are judged too quickly, where assumptions are made without understanding, where arrogance blinds people from seeing the value in others. But like Greg, we all have a choice. We can hold on to our ignorance, or we can open our minds, listen, and grow. Greg lost everything because of his arrogance. But what he truly lost wasn't just a job. It was the false belief that he was untouchable, that he could look down on others without consequences. His regret was real because, for the first time, he understood what he had thrown away. So let this be a reminder. Never underestimate someone just because of where they come from or what they look like. Never let pride blind you from learning and growing. And most importantly, never think respect is something you can demand. It's something you have to earn. And if you enjoyed this story and its lesson, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful stories just like this one. Here on this channel, we bring you stories that challenge perspectives, inspire change, and remind us of the values that truly matter: respect, integrity, growth. These aren't just words. They're choices we make every single day. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, maybe a friend, a coworker, or even just someone who could use a little reminder that true success isn't about stepping on others, it's about lifting others up. And don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss another story. Every episode brings a new lesson, a new challenge, and a new way to see the world. Thank you for watching, and remember, respect isn't about titles, it's about character. See you in the next video.